The moment now confronting Donald Trump carries a different kind of gravity, the sort that does not announce itself with spectacle but with paperwork, deadlines, and demands that cannot be waved away by rhetoric. In recent days, pressure has shifted from political theater to financial reality, and that shift has introduced a form of urgency Trump has historically struggled to neutralize. This is not a rally crowd or a cable news cycle that can be redirected with a sharp insult or a defiant post. It is a set of obligations arriving on schedule, backed by contracts, courts, and lenders who are no longer willing to wait. The tension here comes from the quiet nature of the threat. There are no flashing lights, no dramatic raids. Instead, there is the steady advance of consequences that accumulate whether anyone is watching or not. Legal analysts describe this as the kind of moment when bravado loses its utility. It is a narrowing corridor, where options shrink and the cost of delay increases. The seriousness lies in the fact that this pressure does not depend on public opinion. It depends on compliance, and compliance is no longer optional. According to recent filings and reporting tied to ongoing civil judgments, Trump now faces intensified demands from lenders and bonding companies connected to court-ordered financial obligations. After months of litigation culminating in substantial monetary judgments, the focus has shifted to enforcement. Courts do not simply issue numbers and hope for the best. They require guarantees, bonds, or payments to ensure that judgments are meaningful. In this case, sources close to the proceedings indicate that lenders who once facilitated Trump's ability to post bonds or extend credit are reassessing their exposure. Some are demanding repayment or additional collateral, while others appear unwilling to continue underwriting risk at the scale previously assumed. Legal filings show deadlines that are not symbolic. Missed payments or inadequate guarantees can trigger penalties, interest, or even asset seizures. Judges overseeing these matters have made clear that compliance is not discretionary. Prosecutors and court officers are signaling that the enforcement phase has begun, a stage where patience traditionally runs thin. This shift marks a transition from abstract liability to tangible obligation, and that transition is where legal cases often become truly consequential. What makes this development especially notable is the institutional posture surrounding it. Courts have emphasized uniform application of the rules, rejecting arguments that political stature warrants special consideration. Legal analysts note that once a judgment enters the enforcement phase, the room for maneuver dramatically contracts. Appeals may continue, but they do not automatically pause the requirement to secure payment. That distinction matters. Trump's legal team has sought stays and reductions, but recent rulings suggest skepticism from judges tasked with balancing fairness against delay. According to court documents, bonding requirements were set precisely to prevent judgment debtors from postponing accountability indefinitely. Lenders, for their part, operate under their own regulatory and fiduciary constraints. When risk escalates, they respond not to loyalty or ideology, but to balance sheets. Sources familiar with the financial side of these arrangements describe a growing reluctance to extend further accommodation without immediate compensation. The machinery of enforcement is methodical, and once engaged, it tends to proceed regardless of political noise. That reality underscores why this moment is being watched so closely by legal observers. The broader context here is one of accumulated exposure. Trump is not facing a single isolated demand, but a convergence of obligations arising from multiple cases and financial arrangements. Legal experts point out that when liabilities stack, they interact in ways that amplify pressure. Cash flow becomes constrained, options narrow, and the margin for error disappears. Recent reporting suggests that some lenders are reassessing not just individual loans, but the overall risk profile associated with Trump-related entities. That reassessment can trigger clauses requiring accelerated repayment or additional security. Courts, meanwhile, are attuned to patterns of delay and have shown little appetite for granting repeated extensions. According to sources close to the cases, the message from the bench is consistent: compliance must be demonstrated, not promised. This is why the current phase feels different. It is no longer about whether a verdict will be reached, but about how obligations will be satisfied. The enforcement stage is where legal theory meets financial reality, and that meeting is often uncomfortable for those accustomed to leverage and negotiation. This moment diverges sharply from previous episodes where Trump weathered storms through delay, settlement, or distraction. Historically, his strategy relied on stretching timelines and exhausting opponents. But legal analysts emphasize that enforcement mechanisms are designed precisely to counter that approach. Once a judgment is entered, courts possess tools that do not depend on the defendant's cooperation. Liens, garnishments, and asset seizures are not theoretical possibilities, they are standard procedures. Lenders demanding repayment are acting in anticipation of those tools, seeking to protect themselves before courts act. This creates a feedback loop of pressure. As lenders pull back, Trump's ability to post bonds or refinance obligations diminishes, which in turn increases judicial scrutiny. Sources familiar with the situation describe a sense of compression, where decisions must be made quickly and under less favorable terms. The difference now is that time itself has become an adversary. Each passing day without resolution increases exposure, interest, and institutional impatience. That dynamic is difficult to neutralize with public messaging. There is also the question of credibility, which operates differently in legal and financial settings than in political ones. In court, credibility is measured by compliance history and documentation, not applause. Analysts note that repeated claims of imminent payment or refinancing, if unmet, erode trust with both judges and lenders. Recent proceedings reflect a growing emphasis on proof rather than assurances. This shift places Trump in unfamiliar terrain, where narrative control offers limited relief. Financial institutions are responding to risk signals, not political alignment. When lenders demand repayment, it is not a statement of ideology but a calculation of exposure. That calculation appears to be changing. Legal experts suggest that once confidence erodes at this level, restoring it becomes difficult, especially under public scrutiny. The result is a narrowing set of viable strategies. Delay invites penalties, compliance requires liquidity, and appeals provide no automatic shelter. This confluence of factors explains why observers describe the current moment as qualitatively different from past controversies. Adding to the complexity is the interplay between Trump's personal liabilities and the entities associated with him. Courts have shown willingness to examine the boundaries between individual and corporate responsibility, particularly where commingling or control is evident. According to legal analysts, this scrutiny raises the stakes for asset protection strategies that once relied on formal separations. Recent filings suggest that judges are alert to attempts to shield assets through restructuring or transfer. That vigilance reduces the effectiveness of maneuvers that might otherwise buy time. Lenders, anticipating judicial scrutiny, are adjusting their demands accordingly. This environment rewards transparency and penalizes obfuscation. For a figure accustomed to aggressive negotiation, the rules here are constraining. The legal system prioritizes clarity and enforceability, and deviations invite intervention. As a result, the path forward appears less flexible than before. The mechanisms in play are designed to function regardless of the defendant's preferences, and that design is now being tested. The pressure is not solely financial, it is strategic. Legal experts note that resources devoted to satisfying judgments are resources unavailable for other purposes, including ongoing litigation. This redistribution of attention and capital can have cascading effects. As lenders demand repayment, legal teams must respond to multiple fronts simultaneously, increasing the risk of miscalculation. Sources close to the situation describe an environment of triage where priorities must be reassessed quickly. Courts are aware of these dynamics and are unlikely to accommodate arguments rooted in self-imposed constraint. The expectation is compliance first, negotiation second. That inversion challenges a long-standing approach built on leverage. The current phase rewards those who can demonstrate immediate capacity to meet obligations, not those who promise future resolution. This reality underscores why analysts see the moment as a turning point rather than another episode in a familiar cycle. From a legal reasoning perspective often associated with conservative constitutional analysis, the situation illustrates a foundational principle: the rule of law operates through institutions, not personalities. Courts exist to enforce judgments, and their legitimacy depends on even-handed application. Legal commentators drawing on this tradition emphasize that exceptions for political figures undermine the system itself. Recent rulings reflect an awareness of that risk. Judges have articulated their decisions in language emphasizing procedural regularity and institutional integrity. That framing matters. It signals that the courts view the enforcement of these judgments as a test of their own authority as much as of Trump's compliance. Lenders, aligned with this institutional logic, are responding accordingly. They recognize that courts possess tools that can supersede private negotiation. In this sense, the pressure on Trump is not merely external, it is embedded in the structure of the system he is confronting. The constitutional dimension here is subtle but significant. While civil judgments are not constitutional crises, their enforcement implicates principles of accountability and equality before the law. Legal analysts note that the Constitution does not grant immunity from civil liability based on office or candidacy. Attempts to frame financial obligations as political persecution encounter firm legal boundaries. Courts are obligated to treat judgment debtors uniformly, and deviations invite appellate scrutiny. This framework limits the effectiveness of arguments that seek to politicize enforcement. It also constrains executive branch rhetoric that might otherwise influence outcomes. The separation of powers ensures that courts retain autonomy in these matters. From this perspective, the current enforcement actions demonstrate institutional resilience. They show that legal processes continue irrespective of electoral calendars. That continuity is precisely what makes the moment consequential. It affirms that certain obligations persist regardless of political ambition. Procedurally, the law provides clear guidance on what is permitted and what is not. Judgment debtors may seek stays, post bonds, or negotiate payment schedules, but they must do so within defined parameters. Failure to meet those parameters triggers enforcement. Legal experts stress that courts have little tolerance for gamesmanship at this stage. The emphasis shifts from argument to execution. This is why recent demands from lenders carry such weight. They reflect an understanding that courts will enforce obligations if private arrangements fail. The law does not require judges to accommodate financial inconvenience, particularly when that inconvenience arises from strategic choices. This principle reinforces the seriousness of the current phase. It is not about punishing a defendant, but about ensuring that judgments have meaning. Without enforcement, the judicial system loses credibility. That imperative informs the actions now unfolding. There is also a broader institutional message embedded in these developments. When courts insist on compliance and lenders demand repayment, they signal that legal outcomes have consequences beyond headlines. This message resonates within the financial sector, which relies on predictable enforcement to function. Legal commentators argue that undermining this predictability would have far-reaching effects. As a result, institutions are incentivized to act decisively. The pressure on Trump thus reflects not only his individual circumstances but the system's need to reaffirm its norms. This context helps explain the apparent rigidity of recent responses. Flexibility exists, but only within the law's confines. Outside those confines, enforcement proceeds. That distinction is central to understanding why this moment feels different from earlier legal battles that remained largely theoretical. The story takes a sharper turn when considering an often overlooked detail: the timing of these demands intersects with ongoing appeals and parallel legal proceedings. While appeals continue, they do not erase the immediate need to secure judgments. Legal analysts warn that conflating appellate review with enforcement relief is a common mistake. Courts have repeatedly clarified that the two operate on separate tracks. This separation means that even a successful appeal does not retroactively excuse non-compliance in the interim. The result is a window of vulnerability where obligations must be met without certainty of ultimate outcome. For Trump, this creates a paradox. Complying requires resources that may not be easily recoverable, while resisting invites enforcement that could be more damaging. This dilemma reframes earlier assumptions about delay as a viable strategy. It suggests that the costs of compliance and non-compliance are converging in ways that leave little room for maneuver. Another overlooked aspect involves the reputational impact within financial markets. Lenders operate on confidence, and recent developments may influence perceptions beyond the immediate cases. Analysts note that demands for repayment send signals to other institutions evaluating exposure. This signaling effect can accelerate tightening conditions. What begins as a specific enforcement action can evolve into a broader reassessment of risk. Sources familiar with financial circles suggest that this dynamic is already in motion. The consequence is a self-reinforcing cycle where reduced access to credit increases pressure, which in turn justifies further caution from lenders. This cycle is difficult to reverse once established. It represents a structural shift rather than a temporary setback. Understanding this dynamic reframes the narrative from isolated legal trouble to systemic financial constraint. The seriousness deepens when considering the possibility that enforcement actions could intersect with asset valuation disputes. Courts may scrutinize claimed valuations, particularly if they affect bond requirements or repayment capacity. Legal experts point out that discrepancies between public statements and sworn representations can invite further inquiry. This scrutiny adds another layer of risk. It means that attempts to downplay obligations publicly while contesting them privately could backfire. Judges are attentive to consistency, and inconsistencies undermine credibility. This attention amplifies the consequences of miscalculation. The enforcement phase thus becomes a test not only of financial capacity but of strategic coherence. Observers note that navigating this phase requires precision and restraint, qualities that have not always characterized Trump's legal approach. Looking ahead, legal experts outline a range of possible developments, each contingent on choices made in the coming weeks. Compliance could stabilize the situation, albeit at significant cost. Partial compliance might invite stricter oversight. Non-compliance risks accelerated enforcement. Courts possess discretion in tailoring remedies, but that discretion narrows when deadlines are missed. Political consequences also loom. Public attention to enforcement actions can influence perceptions of competence and credibility. While legal outcomes are not determined by polls, the broader environment shapes strategic options. Institutions are sensitive to legitimacy, and sustained controversy can harden positions. Analysts caution that the next steps will likely be incremental rather than dramatic, but no less consequential for being so. The most likely scenario, according to legal observers, involves continued pressure punctuated by procedural rulings that clarify obligations. Appeals will proceed, but enforcement will not pause indefinitely. Lenders may negotiate, but from a position of strength. Courts will monitor compliance closely. Each development will build on the last, creating a cumulative effect. This process is often misunderstood as slow, but its impact compounds over time. For Trump, the challenge lies in managing multiple timelines simultaneously. Political calendars do not align neatly with legal ones, and conflicts between the two create tension. That tension is now visible in the convergence of demands and deadlines. Public reaction adds another variable. While supporters may dismiss enforcement as unfair, institutions operate independently of sentiment. Legal experts emphasize that sustained non-compliance can erode sympathy even among neutral observers. The narrative shifts from disagreement over verdicts to questions about respect for the law. That shift has implications beyond any single case. It influences how future claims are received and how institutions respond. In this sense, the current moment is not only about resolving obligations but about setting precedents for behavior. The stakes extend beyond immediate financial outcomes to the broader question of institutional authority. Zooming out, this episode fits within a longer arc of accountability that has gradually closed in. Past moments of legal jeopardy often dissipated without tangible consequence. This one appears different because it engages enforcement mechanisms that operate with relative autonomy. Comparisons to earlier political figures facing financial reckoning are instructive but limited. The uniqueness here lies in the scale and visibility of the obligations, combined with the institutional resolve to enforce them. This convergence marks a departure from symbolic conflict toward substantive resolution. It challenges assumptions about immunity through prominence. The law, in this instance, is asserting its routine authority, and that assertion carries weight precisely because it is unremarkable. As the situation continues to unfold, uncertainty remains the defining feature. Outcomes are not predetermined, and choices made now will shape what follows. Compliance could mitigate damage, resistance could exacerbate it. Institutions will respond to actions rather than statements. The quiet urgency of this moment lies in that reality. There are no guarantees, only probabilities informed by precedent and procedure. Observers will be watching not for dramatic declarations, but for filings, payments, and rulings. The significance of this phase is not that it resolves everything, but that it narrows the range of plausible futures. In that narrowing, the true test of accountability emerges, leaving open the question of how it will ultimately be met.